Find a new way to live in Toronto's coveted Forest Hill neighborhood. Foray by Canderel blends thoughtful, livable suite design with refined finishes and more than 50,000 square feet of amenities, including wellness spaces, work-from-home areas, fitness facilities, and places to unwind. A modern, elevated community crafted for the life you've earned. Your next home starts from $599,000. Learn more at live@foray.ca. That's live@foret.ca.
I was thrown back to my years trekking through Africa, where every country felt like a graveyard, and where the...
Stephen Lewis believed that indifference is a choice. A law school dropout who once debated John F. Kennedy, Lewis led the Ontario NDP. Before him, his father David helped found the party that became the National NDP, which his son Avi now leads. But the late Stephen Lewis's greatest impact came far from Canadian politics. He helped save millions of lives during Africa's AIDS crisis 25 years ago, and to this day, his foundation still supports the orphan children and grandmothers left behind. And in very different ways, the other prominent Jewish Canadians who we remember today on this episode of the CJN's Honourable Mention lived that same instinct. Unlike Lewis, who was known as a skilled orator, as you heard, the other community leaders weren't known for speeches, although one was known for his singing voice, but they were known for what they built and what they gave. Al Austin of Calgary went from being a one-hit 1950s boy band to building the Weight Watchers business in Western Canada, and then turned his success, together with his late partner Buddy Victor, into millions for culture, hospitals, theaters, and Camp Bibi Rebak. Sarah Vered was a teenage Haganah fighter at the birth of Israel, who later helped bring Israeli and Jewish culture to her adopted home in Ottawa. Wolf Bronnett survived Auschwitz, started a new life in Montreal, and started running the streets. Just like the Pied Piper, lots of people followed him. And his Wolfpack running club eventually helped send 14 ambulances to Israel through Magen David Adom. He died just before Passover. And author and journalist Sandra Gottlieb moved through media, politics, and diplomacy with a sharp voice on the page that made her impossible to ignore, as was the famous slap that was heard around the world. I'm Ellin Bessner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Wednesday, May 20th, 2026. Welcome to North Star, the Yizkor edition ahead of Shavuot this week. We're the flagship podcast of the Canadian Jewish News and made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Over 1,000 people attended a memorial service for Stephen Lewis at Toronto's Metropolitan University on April 26th, including retired Supreme Court Chief Justice Rosalie Abella, who called Lewis a hero, a mensch, and the only Jewish saint she knew. Lewis once made Time magazine's list of one of the world's 100 most influential people. The CJN's obituary columnist Heather Ringel joins North Star today to reveal how Lewis and the other 4 featured Honourable Mention gave back to their communities in both words and deeds. And she joins me now. And it's great to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
You too. Thank you.
Well, you've had such a fascinating cast of characters who we've lost in the last few months to write about, to honor as Honourable Mention. Well, I'm wondering whether our listeners, any of you might remember out there, a 1956 hit song by a Canadian boy band called the Rover Boys, who moved to the States and made it big. And the hit was called Graduation Day.
We'll remember always graduation day.
Well, Al Austin was one of those 4 members, and that's the subject of our first Honourable Mention. Al Austin, who passed away in his late 90s, and you had the privilege to write about him. Tell us more about Al Austin from Calgary.
Al Austin, as you said, was a doo-wop singer back in the 1950s. He was born in Saskatoon, but grew up in Edmonton, and he was youngest of 7 kids, always loved performing. In fact, in Edmonton in the early 50s, he was friends with Robert Goulet, and future Senator Tommy Banks, who had a club there. And he decided to make it big. First went to Toronto and then on to New York, as you mentioned. He was part of this group called the Rover Boys. It was kind of a one-hit wonder with a song called Graduation Day in 1956. And he ended up falling in love with the group's lead singer, Buddy Victor, and they were together for 67 years. In the States, as part of the Rover Boys, he was there when Paul Anka's career started, and just a really great time until things sort of petered out and they didn't have a lot more singing to do, and he returned to Edmonton. Buddy followed him and wasn't sure what to do with his life. Buddy's mother had suggested that there was a business opportunity that he come back to New York, and she set up a meeting with Jean Niedrich, who was starting, as we know, a company called Weight Watchers at the time. And Al ended up cobbling together some money, and he bought the Alberta and Saskatchewan franchises. He and Buddy ran these franchises. It did extremely well until in 2013, they decided to sell their shares, and they pocketed a nice amount of money. And they were extremely generous supporting the arts. They also invested and funded some original plays on Broadway, like Little Shop of Horrors, Hairspray, Back to the Future. And they gave a lot of money very quietly over the years. They gave donations to the Art Gallery of Alberta, Calgary Fitness Center, also a lot of Jewish charities.
We had just sold our business in a way, and we had money, and we said, we'll do something like that. So we said, we want to be anonymous. And as the building was going up, they kept saying, where can we put your name? We said, we want to be anonymous. We kept saying anonymous. Finally, they said, look, you're two guys who don't have any families. You got to leave a legacy for yourself. Put your name on the building. So we said, okay. So we put their name on the building. But the day we went up to look at it for the first time, it's the top floor of the museum, and it's got 2 doors. And then over each door is our names. And he looks up and he says, Buddy does. He looks up and he says, it's so small.
That was from an interview with Al Austin from last summer. He was interviewed by the local CBC radio station in Calgary about a $5 million gift they gave to the Glenbow Museum, where he and his late life partner's name are on the wall.
And one of the final things he did was he pledged $1 million to Camp B'nai B'rith Rebak in Alberta. And Buddy died in several years before that. So he was by himself, with just a very friendly, gregarious, beloved figure in Alberta.
Why did he want to help Jewish youth go to camp?
I think, especially after October 7th, he just had a passion about the Jewish community. He loved children. He didn't have children of his own, and really saw that was a place that they could enjoy and celebrate their Jewishness. He never went to Israel, unfortunately, but he just was extremely Zionistic and passionate about it. So.
But he was also sort of rubbing shoulders with a lot of these famous people, like the Rat Pack I was reading when they were traveling in Vegas. You remember some of the names of those famous singers, entertainers?
Yeah, really, the group traveled all around the U.S. and they were opening acts for these guys. Frank Sinatra, he had rubbed shoulders, as you said, the Rat Pack. So Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr. He also met Elvis Presley in Vegas. And at one point, the Paul Anka story was that he traveled to New York with a group, and Paul Anka came along with them. And he introduced Anka to a producer who recorded some of his songs, and they really gave Paul Anka his start. So it was all a lot of fun. Yeah. But he was very philanthropic, very beloved, also very, involved in LGBT causes and AIDS research in Alberta. When times when it was still very difficult. It wasn't widely accepted, but he really helped.
You talked earlier, Heather, about the LGBT community and AIDS, and I think this might be a good place to segue into Stephen Lewis, former UN ambassador, a former savior maybe of millions of lives in Africa who were at risk or had caught AIDS and HIV, towering intellect, rhetoric, orator.
I noticed there was a sort of titter of incredulity and some somewhat cynical applause at the reference of honorary degrees. And I felt I should begin with a confessional. I attended 4 post-secondary institutions of celebrated higher learning over an infinite number of years and managed never, but ever, to acquire a degree. I therefore spent my entire adult life shamelessly lusting after honorary degrees. And it has served me well, although I'm prepared to offer them for sale at a discounted price.
The family and his friends had a celebration of life on April 26th at Toronto Metropolitan University. Thousands of people watched online. Heather, 54 countries in Africa were online watching. 1,200 people attended in person. You never met him, but of course, growing up in Canada, what were you aware of his origins?
Clearly, he was from a family that was absolutely connected to socialism. Just his grandfather, he was a Polish Jewish immigrant and an activist in the Jewish Labor Committee in Montreal. And then, of course, his father, David Lewis, who was a national secretary of the CCF and later federal NDP leader. And then, of course, now his son, who is federal NDP leader again. And his work with AIDS, of course. And I think that he was so respected just in a bipartisan way across the board. The fact that Brian Mulroney appointed him as Canada's ambassador to the UN. And also, I found a fun fact, which I thought was very interesting, was that he debated John F. Kennedy in 1957 when Kennedy came to Hart House. And here we had Stephen Lewis, a 19-year-old, debating the future president of the United States.
Hey, who won that debate? And this was at U of T. Who won?
Yes, I believe that Kennedy won the debate. So unsurprisingly, and I know that he also remarked that there were no women allowed in Hart House at that time, and so there was a protest outside with a lot of women who were quite upset not to be able to attend. As things change, and of course, his wife Michelle Landsberg was also very upset about that at the time. So.
As she would be. And at this memorial service, much was made of the foundation of his feminism and support for women's rights that stemmed from what he got at home from Michelle, who was a champion of women's rights. Despite his political fame here in Canada and his rise to the head of the Ontario NDP, his biggest impact, perhaps, came far away from Canadian domestic politics. And a South African newspaper recently paid tribute to him, saying, "The man who shamed the world into seeing Africa's AIDS catastrophe," which I thought put it really, really well. Mm-hmm. What do we know about his work?
He was a UN special envoy, and he went to Africa. He did listen to people there, which was no one else was really doing it at the time. And this was in the very early 2000s. He listened to grandmothers who had buried their children and were now raising grandchildren. And he came back and named names. He knew who these people were, and he accused the G8 group of turning their backs on this crisis. He co-founded the Stephen Lewis Foundation with his daughter in 2003, and he brought 100 African, 200 Canadian grandmothers together in Toronto in something called the Grandmothers Campaign in 2006. And it was something that really brought that, as you said, to the forefront here. So,
and eventually, of course, you said that the G8 and the international community also was kind of hoarding the medicine. Because of this attention, he wouldn't let up. He went to everyone who he could think of to call it out. Mm-hmm. Finally, I want to ask you about something a bit controversial. According to Avi, his father had come to take a different position on Israel.
Well, I know that he required a walker. He was frail. He stood for over an hour outside his former riding to protest the deaths in Gaza. Um, he was very connected Jewishly, but just a very strong conscience about what he believed was right and wrong. And he was very passionate about that cause, certainly.
It's not to say that he didn't also fight anti-Semitism, which he had endured or witnessed while he was in the diplomatic and political world, and always was sympathetic to Israel as a refuge for Jews. But after October 7th, he and his wife became visible on the protest circuit for Palestinian rights. Somebody said he was the greatest premier Ontario never had. Coming up, why the University of Ottawa has launched a new student award and also a lecture series in honor of patron Sarah Vered, and also in honor of the late Dr. Gertrude Rosenberg, a Holocaust survivor and psychologist who died 2 weeks after Vered at the age of 95. We spoke about the diplomatic and parliamentary circles that Stephen Lewis moved in, and kind of parallel to that is our next honorable mention, Sandra Gottlieb, a Canadian journalist, novelist, whose husband, Ellin Gottlieb, was Canadian ambassador to Washington. And Sandra made her own name for kind of being like a page 6, if you know what I mean, for Canadian listeners. That's like a New York City newspaper with all the bold face of who's who of society. And she would kind of write books and articles for very important newspapers about all the goings on in diplomatic Washington and then Canada in the social world. So I guess one of the things our listeners may remember was the slap that was heard around the world, which I'm sure she didn't want to be remembered by and wouldn't want to be, but we got to talk about it because it's famous.
We could talk about it. Although, as you said, I think that given the era that it happened in, she was hosting parties, a number of parties. They were the toast of the town in Washington, and everyone wanted to attend the parties that they hosted at the Canadian Embassy. They would have celebrities like Christopher Plummer, Donald Sutherland, and amazing. She would put actors next to intellectuals and mix things up. And unfortunately, this happened in private. She was planning a party. She said she was absolutely over hungry, hadn't eaten, was cranky. Her secretary had told her someone wasn't attending. She got really upset and slapped her. This is before the party started, and someone saw it. And at the time, it just went, what today we would say went viral. And that was it was an incident that really was meant to be kind of a private thing, and but it really became one of the things that she became known for latterly. However, she also, as we go back to, was already an award-winning Canadian journalist and writer when she went to Washington. She was a humorist. She had written many food articles for Chatelaine magazine and had written contributed to books here. So she went down already with a career, and this was an unpaid position as wife of.
And that was the name of her column in the Washington Post, wife of. Yeah, I love it.
She was picked up by the Washington Post. She had met her husband when she was 19 and in Winnipeg. He was already an Oxford prof, and he had come back to visit his parents in Winnipeg. And it was a little bit of a setup. They wanted him to marry a local girl, and she just wanted to get the heck out of Winnipeg. So she went right from Winnipeg to Oxford, and things took off. So it was quite a career. And as you said, anyone in the 1980s would remember these columns, and they were very funny, and they really did open the kimono a little bit on what went on behind the scenes in Washington. So
here's a clip from Sandra Gottlieb being interviewed in 1990 by a CBC journalist to try to explain that she really didn't want to talk much about the slap of her assistant while hosting a party for Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and the American Vice President George H.W. Bush, while she was the wife of Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Ellin Gottlieb.
It was very hectic, but I should have been able to handle all that. I was fifth year as ambassador's wife. 7:30 at night, I had to go and look, see who was coming, and the guests, and start rearranging stuff, and I kind of everything, and I was hungry, and I was tired, and everything kind of exploded. But you see, this was a very private incident. This was not in front of the bushes. This was not in front of the guests. This was outside in the front lawn. The guests were not. There was no guests around.
No, I understand that, but still, you did slap her.
And I apologized immediately afterwards.
But there's you talk in the book thereafter about both the support that you got from many people, Barbara Bush included, also at the way the press ran with this, and you seem surprised that the press would have thought this was a big story. I mean, are you still? It was a big story.
It wasn't a big story because it had nothing to do. It was such a tiny incident. It was not public. If I had sort of slapped my social secretary in front of the prime minister, I mean, that is the way the story was presented over and over and over again. And there is nothing I could do to defend myself.
One of the things I love about her, there's a quote that she said, "For some reason, a glaze passes over people's faces when you say Canada." She told the New York Times when she first arrived in Washington. Now, in Ottawa, Sarah Vered, the Israeli-born philanthropist, educator, founder of Israeli and Judaic studies programs, and basically helped bring culture and Israeli culture and Jewish culture to Ottawa. So she was married to Zev Vered. They were from Israel. Her father owned a pasta factory. She was a Haganah activist fighter when she was a teenager after high school, and was around at the founding of the birth of Israel. And I have to tell you, they came to Canada, and they were probably the first, of what we're told, Israeli students who ever got accepted to go to McGill. He got an engineering degree, and then they moved to Ottawa, where they started a construction firm, a construction conglomerate that it became, and that's where they made their wealth. But they gave much of it away, and were so involved in the Jewish community.
Well, I can see that she had left $1 million endowment to create called the Vered Jewish Canadian Studies program, which includes courses on Jewish heritage and history in Canada. There's about 200 students have gone through it since it was founded in 2005. And apparently she attended these courses that she funded, including writing essays and participating low key in the class. And she just really, she was a regular student. And
at age, I guess, 90 or something.
At age, right. And just so much philanthropy, the Vered Israel Cultural and Educational Program at the JCC, a research fellowship and cardiology chair at University of Ottawa Heart Institute, a National Gallery. I know she's a member of the Order of Canada. And I mean, I think that her family said that really, to understand her, the book she wrote, Among the Defenders of Israel, it really explains so much. I mean, she was able to bring her experiences as a 17-year-old, high school student who was in the War of Independence, going through all of that, and then coming to Canada and establishing a life here.
Keep on working hard the way you're doing, and you'll be blessed. So, work, study, and remember our traditions, our beliefs, and you'll be successful.
That was Sarah Vered speaking in May last year, sending a message to her community as donors and Federation joined in a Generations event where she received the Meyaseret HaDorot Award, which means Generational Founder. I think you mentioned that the National Gallery, where she and her philanthropy are left legacies, but the National Arts Center, the NAC, is really where her name got honored every year by a concert, I was told.
She was a very big supporter of the National Arts Center, the Orchestra Mentorship Program, which allows musicians to work and learn from orchestra members. They dedicate a performance to her every year. So she was very involved, and she loved meeting the musicians and hearing how people had influenced them. So
I know that the flag flew at half-mast on February 28th at the NAC, so in her honor, which is quite something. And we should say that I was listening to the eulogy, the ceremony for Stephen Lewis, and Olivia Chow got the City of Toronto to get the CN Tower to be lit up in orange the night of his memorial service.
I was put on this planet to help people.
I wanted to bring us to Montreal, and Holocaust survivor and runner extraordinaire, fundraiser extraordinaire, Wolf Bronnett.
So, well, firstly, he was 102 when he died. So the running seems to have paid off. And he started running in the 60s. And as I did a little bit of research, I actually spoke to Canadian Running Magazine, and they were shocked. They had no idea. And I was told this is probably the first running club, the Wolf Pack, in Canada. It just didn't exist until the 70s. So
street running, not in the gym, but on the streets. This is what's so amazing about it. No one ever did that.
It was a very odd sight in the 1960s to see a bunch of people running through the streets, running up Mount Royal. He also was, importantly, a Holocaust survivor. He was put into the Russian Gulag in a Siberian forced labor camp during the war. He started this running at age 40, and he met, just jumping back to the war, he met his future wife, Henya, in a DP camp. His sister also thankfully survived the war along with his brother, and introduced them there. He was an integral member of helping the Jewish Y just flourish in Montreal. And the Wolfpack, their neshama is still in the building. There's still bagels that will come out on Sundays that are sponsored, whether by like remaining Wolfpack members or children of the Wolfpack. The Wolfpack raised money for so many causes and was just supportive. But the big thing that they did was Magen David Adom, 14 ambulances. The 14th was donated on Wolf's 100th birthday in 2024. They also supported Terry Fox Run, Heart and Stroke, JNF, and cancer research. He really was Mr. Y. And
I remember going to the March to Jerusalem, which is like the Toronto Walk with Israel, except they ran it 25K up onto the mountain. And I remember they had their distinctive white T-shirts with the sort of Adidas, style shorts in those days. And they did marathons around North America. And you know how much it costs to raise money for one Magen David Adom, like a plain ambulance with not all the extra trimmings. Yeah. That's like between $100,000 and $180,000 for each of these ambulances. So he did 14 of them, which is amazing. We do need to pay tribute to somebody who was part of the CJN family, as our last mention of honorable mention, Lionel Schipper. He was on the board of directors as well as a donor. His name still appeared in the last couple of editions of the Scribe Quarterly, our CJN's magazine, who was a lawyer, co-founded the CJ PAC Political Affairs Committee, Order of Canada recipient, very supportive of the Bor-Alaskan Law Library, the U of T Law Library, a health division at the U of T, major donor, major legal figure, also on the board of big names like the Four Seasons Hotel, Toronto Sun. Born in Toronto, 1932, he died February 5th at the age of 93. And two things. First of all, he apparently, according to this family's obituary, he was an avid birder, which I am, so that was amazing to hear that. But also, he was a long-time customer of the House of Chan, Chinese restaurant in the Eglinton Bathurst Avenue Road area that was owned by a Jewish guy, started by a Jewish guy to feed egg rolls to Jewish people who lived in that area of Toronto. So all in all, a very interesting episode, Heather. May their memories be a blessing, and thank you so much for bringing these amazing stories to our audience for this edition of the CJN's Honourable Mention. We'll see you again. And that's what Jewish Canada sounded like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Do you have any memories of connection with any of our Honourable Mention? You can write to us at info@thecjn.ca. The show is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman with Izzy Helenchild. Michael Freeman is the executive producer. Alicia Richler is our editorial director. We're closed for the Shavuot holiday, so we'll be back on Monday, May 25th. Thanks for listening.